Well, thank you, Louisa, for the kind invitation to speak. It is wonderful to see so many people here tonight, although I confess it's also not a little terrifying, but I'm very grateful to you all for coming here on, well, for some of you, a Tuesday evening to share some thinking, some kind of preliminary thinking, really, about light and lighting in devotional practices. So what I'd like to do is start with an assertion or a suggestion, at the very least, that in the Middle Ages, light was the single most important product of devotion. And indeed, I think we might say that is still the case today and across the globe. There's no way of meaningfully proving a claim like this, I'm sure, but nor do I think it's a very controversial statement, especially for those who commonly deal with medieval wills, endowments, or miracle stories, or other kind of sources. Yet, despite this importance of light for devotion, I suggest that we, historians and art historians, don't always know exactly what to do with it and how to treat it. There are a number of reasons for this, I think, but one important factor is that the so-called material turn has focused on stuff, but not so much on the immaterial, such as light and darkness. And this has left us in some ways ill-equipped to think about the immaterial and about light and darkness. Although, as we look at these images on the screen, they also demonstrate that fuel for lighting and its containers themselves constitute an important body of stuff when it comes to light. So in a sense, the material and the immaterial cannot be separated, I think. So what I want to do in this paper is pursue three aims more or less simultaneously. So first, I'd like to suggest that light was central to the economy of devotion in the Middle Ages, at least as much as any images, rituals, relics, or votive objects. And this was true at all levels of society. This is implicitly acknowledged, I think, in lots of scholarship, but rarely explored. It's not unusual, for example, for historians to enumerate the quantity of candles given to a certain image or a shrine. But usually the analysis stops there, effectively repeating the terms of endowments or miracle stories. But there's much to be learnt, I suggest, from a more systematic consideration of the accumulation of lights in devotional contexts and at different levels of society. And this, I have to acknowledge, is work that's already been begun by the likes of David Dendy, David Postles, Ben Nielsen, and especially Catherine Vincent, amongst others. But I think there's still more to be done. So my second aim is to sketch a number of possible approaches to the study of light and lighting. This includes, for example, the rhetorical tradition explored by John Gage and Paul Binsky that connected light with joy and jocunditas or laetitia, much as we now talk about a smile lighting up a face. And this is something that Paul Binsky has written about a great deal, the association in the sources that we have between lighting, and joy. It brings joy to those that look at it. But I've also found it helpful on a perhaps more prosaic level, to think, for example, of donations of lights, not in terms of numbers of candles or lamps, but as the gift of light itself at particular moments and for a certain length of time. So I'd like us to think, for example, not about someone donating, 100 £1 candles to the shrine of St. Edward, but to think about what that means in terms of light, that they're giving light that's going to last for a certain amount of time and burn and give light at certain feast days and at certain moments in the liturgy. And then my third aim is to explore the art historical implications of these ideas. Art historians very commonly refer, sometimes somewhat vaguely, to the effects of flickering candlelight on a gilded altarpiece or reliquary or some such. And I mean, I know I do that all the time. But inspired by a rich ekphrastic tradition, those working on Islamic, Byzantine, and late antique art have in recent years suggested new and exciting ways to think about lighting effects. And I think that some of these ideas can be profitably applied to objects, devotional objects from other periods. So I'm thinking here of scholars like Vladimir Ivanovici, Liz James, Brisera Pencheva, and Nadine Shabila, amongst many others. And I would like to be clear as well that when I talk about light and lighting in this way, I do so quite deliberately apart to a large extent from a tradition of neo-Dionysian or neo-Platonic approaches to light, practiced by scholars like Edgar de Bruyne, Erwin Panofsky, or Otto von Simpson, amongst others. So light has long been a source of interest to art historians, but in rather different ways. So in the last few years, I've become obsessed with this question of light, really, and have been scouring written archaeological and visual evidence to understand the management of light, both artificial light, the light from candles, lamps, and so on, but also natural light coming from windows and ultimately from the sun, in a range of case studies, including Cordoba's Great Mosque, Leon Cathedral, English parish churches in the 13th and 14th centuries, and in relation to the cult of St. Thomas of Canterbury. But today, what I'd like to do is step back from that detail and consider some of these issues more broadly, temporarily putting aside questions of natural lighting in order to focus on devotional practices, broadly defined, and the provision of artificial light in the late Middle Ages. And this, I should make an issue that I think has been given renewed urgency by recent efforts to reconstruct different objects and spaces. Something that has been happening for a number of years, but in the current environment has obviously become much more important and critical. But what's also significant, I think, is the sophistication of these models has grown tremendously, so that it's now modelers who are able to model light in very advanced ways, who are asking questions of historians about how lighting worked and operated. And I think these are questions sometimes that historians and art historians aren't in a position yet to answer, but that we should certainly think about. So in one respect, we can think about light and lighting through the work of these kinds of visual reconstructions, which can be both a way of engaging students and other people unfamiliar with objects and buildings, but also can be a productive research tool in their own right, prompting new kinds of questions. But I think it would be wrong to imagine that light as something immaterial has left no trace, that we have to depend on these kinds of reconstructions to think about it. Sometimes we can trace it very literally, and I'm showing you here a couple of examples of scorch marks left by left by candles placed on the altar, presumably too close to the altarpieces that were set onto those altars, and they've left these scorch marks that you can see on the heads of St. Dominic and St. Francis here. Or we might identify the traces of votive candles in the form of dripping wax, sometimes located on wall paintings, which leaves an indication that candles were once affixed to the wall as an offering to the images, sometimes those images now lost. Occasionally, we can also think about those lighting objects themselves. Most of them, of course, have burned away and are now lost to us, but we have a number of sources that can give us clues about their appearance and how they were conceived. So I'm showing you here, for instance, a rare case of these early medieval candles from Oberflat in Germany from the 6th, 7th century. A rare surviving example of a candle from archaeological context that can be dated with some certainty. But I'm also showing you on the right-hand side here a candle stock from the British Museum. It's not a candle, but it's painted to look like a candle. The candle would in fact be placed on top of it, perhaps decorated in the same way. And the effect of these candle stocks was to give the illusion that candles were larger than they actually were, which is why they were sometimes called Judas candles. And I show you also an image of a similar kind of candle from a wonderful manuscript bought by the British Library a few years ago, which shows a similar Paschal candle, one of these great candles lit for the Easter feast, which has the same or a rather similar decoration of spiraling green and yellow forms. And this design found on the candlestock and illustrated here conforms with what we know about the way that candles were decorated in the Middle Ages. So, for instance, there's a shrine customary from Canterbury from 1428, which describes a series of candles that were, quote, appropriately adorned with red and green paint, the one red, the next green, with roses and flowers of gold and other colours delicately worked in. And we can find other descriptions of coloured and sometimes even perfumed candles from a number of other sources. But it's also important, I think, to recognise that beeswax was far from being the most important fuel in the Middle Ages. There was a kind of hierarchy of fuels, with beeswax and vegetable oils at the top, emitting the cleanest, least smoky light, and tallow and resin near the bottom. So tallow candles, for example, sometimes known as parish candles, were easily made at home with reduced animal fat, and they were significantly cheaper than wax candles. But they were also more susceptible to guttering and sagging and dripping, and they burnt with a greasy odour. Torches made of wax mixed with resin, on the other hand, were slow burning and were especially used for funerary processions, but they also tended to sputter and smoke. So we can think about a hierarchy of different fuels, and we can see that as well played out when we think about different kinds of oils. Here I'm showing you a wonderful page from the Cantigas de Santa Maria, the manuscript that's now in Florence, illuminated in the 1270s, early 1280s, that tells the miracle of the Benedictine monastery of Libella in northwestern Spain. And the miracle illustrated here is the fact that linseed oil burned in most of the hanging lamps that we see in this manuscript. These lamps hung, we're told, before 5 altars in the church, but that only clear, pure olive oil could burn before the altar of the Virgin Mary. It was the custom of the people there to try to light that lamp with other oils, but it would always go out right away. Only olive oil, the purest olive oil, was suitable for the Virgin Mary. So this, I think, gives us an insight into, again, this idea of this kind of hierarchy of the fuels. And it's worth noting, I think, that miracle collections, and particularly the Cantigas de Santa Maria, are full of accounts of, give us a very rich insight into the significance of candles and lamps and other lighting devices in the devotional culture of Iberia and the wider and Europe more broadly speaking in the 13th century. So we can think about lighting in relation to devotional culture with respect to the questions of fuel, and we can, I think, locate the supply and consumption of different kinds of lighting fuels within a kind of broad economic perspective. So, for example, Alex Saposnik has shown that in medieval England, most smaller churches would have obtained their wax from local beehives and so on, but the bigger institutions also imported their wax, especially from the Baltic and occasionally from Portugal too. So there is, if you like, a kind of international trade in fuel and therefore in the provision of light. We can also locate inventories recording the presence of Seville oil, i.e. Olive oil in London in the 1370s. But as I've said, most small institutions draw their fuel from the surrounding landscape. And there's a way in which I think that considering wax and oil and their supply allows us to locate these institutions and devotional objects within a kind of a broader landscape. So monasteries, for instance, commonly owned a number of hives that could provide them with wax, whilst in the Mediterranean basin, and particularly in the Iberian material, which I know best, olive plantations were set aside to provide oil for a particular mosque or church. And in fact, they were often named after those mosques or churches. So by these means, the provision of light enmeshed parish churches, abbeys, and cathedrals in a broader social and economic landscape. And here I'm just showing you two often reproduced images from the Taquinum Sanitatis, showing the trade on the right-hand side in olive oil, and on the left, a chandler selling a number of wax items. Income for lighting was also related to the wider urban and rural landscape. So sometimes we can find sources indicating that provision for lighting was made by assigning rental income, but at the lower end of the scale in rural parish churches, David Postles, amongst others, has shown that lighting was also funded by leasing out livestock to local parishioners in order to provide a regular source of lighting. So, for example, at St Michael's in Kirby le Socon in Essex, the lease of no less than 121 sheep owned by the church provided wax or oil for multiple lights in that church in the mid-13th century. But having said this, I think it's also important to underline the fact that it's not correct to imagine that that light and fuel for lighting is entirely ephemeral, that the fuels disappeared and can no longer be, are no longer available to us, because throughout the Middle Ages, there's a strong evidence from a variety of sources of a culture of recycling both oil and lamp, oil and wax. So I'm showing you here on the left, for example, a pilgrim's ampulla from the Holy Land, which might have contained a number of different items. But we know that oil from the lamps that hung around the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem was collected by pilgrims and taken home because of its association with Christ's sepulchre, so that it was in effect recycled and repurposed as a kind of contact relic. Or we can think about the practice of creating the Agnus Dei tokens, tokens that were made from the leftover wax from the great Paschal candle that burned in St. Peter's for the Easter feast. When that candle had burned down, any leftover wax was melted down and stamped with the Agnus Dei and was sent out as a kind of religious or diplomatic gift. And that custom has been traced back to at least the 9th century. But we also have all sorts of records of the recycling and collecting of wax items. So, for example, the miracle collections of St. Thomas Becket from Canterbury recorded on numerous occasions how wax from miraculous candles, particularly candles that miraculously went out and then relit without anyone seeming to light them up again, was then gathered up by pilgrims as, again, a kind of miraculous object. Or we can think of the widespread practice of reusing wax from Paschal candles. So beyond Rome, Paschal candles, the great Easter candles, were in theory paid for by parishioners. And any wax that remained after Trinity Sunday, after they were put out, was quite commonly fashioned into candles for funerals for the poor. Or we might think of the common stipulation in endowments for lighting, that any wax that remained after candles had burnt for funerals should burn instead on nearby altars. So this process of recycling fuels and, as it were, creating light in new context was quite widespread in the Middle Ages. So far, though, I've concentrated on wax, and we might think of this as the primary and most prestigious fuel for light in Europe, or at least in Northern Europe, throughout most of the Middle Ages. But in Southern Europe and in the Mediterranean, in places that had access to good olive oil, lamps were also important, and olive oil was the primary fuel. I should say that lamps were also used in Northern Europe, but to a lesser extent, principally near the host and occasionally near devotional images. But what's very striking, I think, is that the poor survival rate of lamps from medieval Europe. As far as I can locate, almost no lamps survived from that period. They were either melted down, or they were destroyed or replaced. So here I show a rare selection of different lighting devices that would have held oil. But if anyone has other examples surviving from medieval Europe, I'd be very interested to hear from you. Instead, when art historians engage with questions of lighting and lighting devices, they tend to focus on a few particularly magnificent examples like those that I show here. And these rightly have attracted a great deal of scholarship. But they are, of course, all associated with elite patrons. They give us little insight into the practice of lighting in devotional contexts at lower levels of the social classes. And what these images here, though, do demonstrate, I think, is is two things. One, the way that many of these great lighting devices that survived to us in the Middle Ages are now bereft of their lights for good conservation reasons, so that we no longer see them as they once blazed with lights, and also call attention to the distortion and effects of different forms of lighting. You can see the Trivulzio candelabrum here on the left in the interior of Milan Cathedral, with extraordinarily dark interior, or we can see the Gloucester candlestick here, nicely lit up in this photo from the Victoria and Albert Museum. But of course, that kind of artificial lighting distorts the way that this object would have been originally displayed. So we can think about, and people have thought about, a range of elite and spectacular objects like these ones. But I think we can also think it's also productive to think about light and its provision at a much humbler level, and in a much greater variety than is sometimes considered. And we might think, for example, of the huge quantities of antique ceramic or bronze lamps that survive from the Mediterranean basin. But if we also mine different kinds of written sources, visitation records, inventories, and endowments, for example, we can also begin to reconstruct the tremendous variety of light and lighting devices in even quite humble parish churches. So, for example, I've been looking recently at the evidence for English parish churches in the 13th and 14th centuries, and those written sources describe oil lamps, usually burning before the high altar or the host, considered less susceptible to drafts than candles. They tended to burn night and day, so they needed to be draft proof. But also candlesticks of pewter, bronze, iron, wood, latten, silver, copper, and lead. Paschal candlesticks licked by a long taper or serpent from Holy Saturday till Ascension Day. Hearses, which could be the triangular multi-branch candlesticks of Easter week, or iron structures, also known as ferratra, that supported candles for funerals. And you see an example here from North Yorkshire. Rowel lights, sometimes called rotunduli or rota in the sources, which were wheel-shaped chandeliers suspended from the roof. And here I show you a couple of pulleys from an English parish church that would have been used to support these kinds of chandeliers. Candles and tapers, of course, and torches made of wax mixed with resin, and slowly burning but smoky, as well as lanterns used when carrying the host to visit the sick. Rushlights, which were made from rushes dipped in fat, were reserved almost exclusively for domestic contexts, while cresset stones, like you see here in the top left, which held lamps with floating wicks, seem to have been used almost exclusively in monastic contexts, and especially in dormitories, though many were moved to parish churches during the Reformation. So where were these lights, and how can they be connected to a culture of devotion? If we return, for example, to the Church of St. Michael's in Kirkby-le-Soken in Essex in the mid-13th century, we know from the visitation records there that lights were placed on the altars or before the images of the Virgin, St. Peter and St. Michael, before the cross, in the chancel, and on the rowel. And this seems to be really pretty common in most parish churches in 13th, 14th century England. They were also commonly lit before the rood screen. And what this kind of evidence does, I suggest, is demonstrates that when it comes to lighting, and of course so much besides, it's not always possible to distinguish between personal devotion, collective devotion, and the liturgy or paraliturgy. So my definition of devotion here is quite broad, partly because the evidence doesn't really allow for kind of neat distinctions between personal devotion and collective or liturgical practices. And one example of that phenomenon is that of Trundles or rota, coiled tapers that certainly from the 12th century onwards were strongly associated with pilgrims. These were lengths of a wick that was measured to the length of the body of the sick devotee, or maybe body parts, that was dipped in wax and then coiled to form these trundles. And I show you a couple of examples here, one from shown in the windows from Canterbury Cathedral, here another example from a life of St. Edward the Confessor, now in Cambridge. So these objects seem to have begun life in connection with the devotion of pilgrims, that they connected with the body, but they start to become more and more popular, and we can track their use, for example, in English parish churches from the 1430s onwards. So they move from the realms of private devotion, if you like, to a more public space. Or we can consider the example of the great trundle recorded at Canterbury Cathedral, which hung near the shrine of St. Thomas Becket and was given every 3 years by the city of Dover. That trundle was equal in length to the circumference of the walls of Dover, so that's about 1,500 yards long, and was stored on a windlass. And the 1428 shrine customary from Canterbury explains that it burned during Mass and for processions. So we don't have that trundle surviving, but here I'm showing you one 18th century that does 18th century example that does survive from France. This one only 250 yards in length compared to the 1,500 yards of Canterbury's trundle, but it gives you some sense of the visual impact of these objects. So they we can think of candlesticks and other lighting devices as having these kind of striking visual characteristics, but also the fuels, the candles themselves. If we stick with Canterbury for a few minutes, I think we can also understand to some extent the democracy of devotional light in the Middle Ages. So miracle accounts from the late 12th century from Canterbury refer, for example, to all manner of humble pilgrims who came to Canterbury and who could buy cheap candles there from the monks or bring them themselves and light them on Becket's tomb, as we see here from this collection of the letters of John of Salisbury now in the British Museum. And we see those devotees with candlesticks placed on Becket's tomb in the crypt of Canterbury Cathedral, but also these long tapers rising out of directly above the heads of the devotees, almost like prayers or something. Those miracle accounts describe evocatively a crowded, stuffy crypt filled with candles brought by devotees, even at the kind of very lowest levels of society. But we also know, for example, that Henry II gave money for lights to burn at Thomas's tomb following his own penitential visit in July in 1174. And after 1220, when Thomas's body was moved to a new shrine in the Trinity Chapel, so up in the new Gothic east end of Canterbury, above where his tomb was, we have records of donations of light from people like Henry III and Edward II, for the very highest levels of society, but also the nobility, so people like Alice, Countess of Eu, or St Edmund de Mortimer. But we also have gifts of light from Andrew the Shrinekeeper, John de Fleet, citizen of London, and John de Vautour, fishmonger. So what I find striking here is that kings and fishmongers were united in their donation of light, even if the quality and persistence of that light depended on the donor. So a king could give much more magnificent lights, of course, but the ultimate product was broadly the same. So what is the significance of light? I think it would be a mistake to try to pin down too closely the particular meaning of all these devotional lights. The symbolic associations of light were so rich and varied that one could offer 100 different interpretations, and all might be valid, but all might not be equally. But broadly speaking, these lights presumably stood in for the presence and prayers of donors who, however briefly, could leave their mark at a devotional site. They represent as well a moment of transcendence, when the material world, wax, oil, or fat, was converted into something immaterial. This, for sure, is the sort of thing that that might be glossed by Abbot Suger, amongst others. But I'm also reminded of more straightforward pleasures, such as the delight enjoyed, for instance, by my own daughters when they light a votive candle in a darkened church, or even the brief thrill of lighting a sparkler, even when outshone by spectacular fireworks above. So these votive candles, these votive lights, offered, I think, in part a moment of intimacy, but also a flash of delight. And I find support for this idea, for example, in the description by the anonymous author of the Annales Paolini of the blaze of candles from 48 square candles lit for the anniversary mass of Eleanor of Castile in Westminster Abbey in 1307. The splendor of lights, wrote the author, shining like a starry sky, gladdened with great joy the hearts of beholding it. So these lights were a source of joy, or were understood to be a source of joy, at least. But how can we think about the effects of these lights more broadly? Scholars of Islamic art have explored, amongst other things, the ways in which inscriptions on mosque lamps including verses from the light verse, might be projected onto walls and floors. And here I show you a couple of examples of lamps with inscriptions where there is potential for those inscriptions to be projected by the light within. And similar suggestions have been made, incidentally, for the shadows cast by Byzantine polycandela, often in the form of a cross. Now, I'm not convinced, I have to say, that all these work quite in the way that we might want them to, but they do, these examples raise important questions, I think, both for the kind of creative possibilities of thinking about the effects of lighting and lighting devices, but also the rich potential for comparative studies between religions and across different contexts. Because devotional lighting is a feature of almost all religions in the Middle Ages and is found in both domestic and religious settings. And I show you here, just as an example, 3 lamps that have only recently been identified as Sabbath lamps. At some point they were thought to be Roman, at some point they were thought to be from churches. It may be that they were reused as churches, but they're generally thought to be Sabbath lamps now, and stand in here, I suppose, for the significance of light across different religious cultures and across Europe and the Mediterranean. And I think that one symptom of this common culture of light and darkness is, for example, the way in which optical theory moved from Arabic to Latin scholars in the 13th century. So to give an example of this, John Peckham, Archbishop of Canterbury, penned in the 1270s, 1280s, his Perspectiva Communis, a treatise on optics that drew on the scholarship of other English clerics such as Roger Bacon and Robert Grothetest, but ultimately drew on the hugely influential treatise on optics of Ibn al-Haytham, which had been translated into Latin in Spain, probably in the 1230s or 1240s. But what's significant, I think, is that the Perspectiva, Peckham's Perspectiva, opens with a whole series of propositions on the effects of bright or coloured lights in dark spaces, on differences between sunlight and candlelight, on the shadows cast by multiple candles, on sculpture lit by excessive light, on polished surfaces, including marble, and on the many things that appear bright when placed in darkness, but disappear or at least cease to shine when exposed to light. What Peckham is doing with these propositions is he's illustrating a whole set of optical theories by, with reference to phenomena that were easily recognizable by those reading the Perspectiva Communis. And there's a suggestion that this treatise is a kind of textbook for optics in the Middle Ages. So he's drawing on common references. And what's striking is that many of those references come ultimately from Ibn al-Haytham, that those that what both texts depend on is their readers' familiarity with a whole series of optical effects that were same whether you were in Al-Andalus in the early 13th century or in Canterbury in the late 13th century. They all belong to a common culture of light, if you like. But these kinds of questions and this kinds of evidence also raises, I think, a number of questions that haven't really been answered yet by art historians or historians of any kind. At what height were lights hung in a church? If they were placed high above the heads of devotees, did they create hierarchies of light? So did you stand in the darkness and in the lower parts of a church and look up to a brighter part? Or if lamps were placed in solid metal bowls, as we see here on the right at Seville, does that mean that their illumination was directed largely toward vaults and ceilings? So their lighting was directed upwards rather than downwards, perhaps counterintuitively. How might bright lights illuminate particular objects, but also throw others into shadow? And how did light interact with daylight, as we see here in this wonderful detail by Jean Foucault, remembering in particular the words of Henry of Avranches, who, writing of Lincoln Cathedral in the mid-1230s, wrote that fire flashes more pleasingly in shadow. So as Henry of Avranches observes, but as we can observe even today, artificial lights look much more spectacular in dark settings when they're not competing with natural light. So what I'd like to do now, just in the final minutes of my talk, is to very briefly explore some of the ways in which art historians might fruitfully engage with light and its effects. And in many respects, art historians have long been doing this, but I think what I would suggest is that if we consider these effects in a much more systematic way, then we can arrive at new understandings of objects and spaces that otherwise seem familiar to us. So sometimes these effects only become evident when we get close up. Only then can we see how artists manipulate sources of light. So we might think, for example, of the multiple glazes built up on the Westminster Retable, or the careful polish of marbles to ensure their shine, or the extraordinarily skilled stippling of the gold work on the Wilton diptych, which sent light flashing in different directions, or the way that mosaicists seem to have quite deliberately set their tesserae at slightly different angles in order to ensure that light flashed off in different directions. We might also think about these by, to some extent, challenging the stable lighting conditions that we encounter when objects are displayed in museums or even in church settings. I show you here, just by way of example, three especially striking examples. On the left, a couple of images of the icon, famous icon of St. Michael in San Marco in Venice, and Visera Pencheva has written about the way that the appearance of this figure changes radically depending on the direction of light. But you can also see here two other images that look very different depending on the direction of light. But these are transformed in some ways. So there's a question here, and it relates to recent studies of kind of photography as well, about the way that we represent these objects in photographs, and the way that different kinds of lighting might transform the effects of these objects. The problem here, the real curse, of course, that we suffer from is that of electric lighting, that we can almost never escape it. So one part of a project to think about devotional lighting might be to really search hard to think about different spaces without artificial or electric light. So here I show, for instance, a very rare photo of the Great Mosque of Cordoba without artificial lights, where you see how the rather small windows in the dome over the mihrab area would flight this most important part of the mosque with natural light in a way that's really difficult to perceive now when entering this space because of the quantity of electric lighting. Or we might think about the current vogue for candlelit services in churches. Here I'm showing an example from York Minster, which allow us to some degree to reconstruct mentally the effect of a multitude of artificial lights in a church interior. We can also draw, I think, to some extent, albeit with caution, on the guidance of contemporaneous images. Here I'm showing you this really fabulous, very small painting by Simon Benning, Villages and the Ways of Church, where we see the faithful gathered within the church, each with their candles. Or here, a detail of a Mass from the Dead with darkened windows, but great tapers lit around the coffin of the deceased. I think there's also potential to think about later representations of natural lighting, albeit with, of course, a number of necessary caveats about pictorial conventions, conventions of tenebrism, or even romanticism. But I think we shouldn't dismiss examples like these. We have to take seriously the effects of lights, artificial lights, but not electric lights, as observed by artists in later periods. And these, I think, represent a kind of untapped resource for thinking about these spaces without the curse of electric lighting. And I want to finish tonight just with two images of what has come for many art historians to be a kind of a poster child for a kind of renewed idea about the light ages, so-called light ages. The Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, shown here in daylight, but also shown here at night and with lights. Now, these lights, of course, are artificial ones, but we have a great deal of evidence about the kinds of candles and lamps that were to be hung in the Sainte-Chapelle in the Middle Ages. So I will just read briefly the second charter of the Sainte-Chapelle from August 1248, which details with some precision the way that these were to burn. So, quote, "We order that 3 candles, which weigh at least 3 pounds each, continue to burn every day and night in silver candelabra or basins, these are bacinis argentae, before the major altar. On feast days, at vespers, matins, and at the major mass on the major altar before the sanctuary burn 4 candles. In feasts of 9 lessons, and on Sundays 6 candles. In feasts which are done as semi-duplex, 8. In duplex feasts, 12 candles. In annual feasts, 24, with each candle weighing 2 pounds. Besides these, we also wish that in each annual feast, at mass, at matins, and in first and second vespers, and every day when a high mass of the holy relics is done, will burn 12 candles, each of which will weigh 10 pounds, around the holy relic box, 6, namely on the one side 6 and 6 on the other, and a certain number during the octaves of the reception of the crown of thorns, the holy cross, or the holy relics of the holy crown of thorns." So what this, I think, epitomizes is the detail and the attention which was given to artificial lighting in the Middle Ages. But it also underlines the fact, for example, that these buildings and these objects were to be experienced not only when flooded by natural light, but also at vespers, at matins, at times of day when natural light wouldn't flood in, and when those burning lights would radically shift our perception of devotional objects and indeed whole buildings like this, as we have at the Sainte-Chapelle. So serious consideration of the immaterial, I suggest, can shed light on devotional practices at all levels, but it also holds the potential radically to transform our understanding of a material world, rendering the familiar unfamiliar, but also, I think, offering us a little bit of joy too. So thank you, I've finished there.